You know what finally pushed me over the edge? I'd built a beautiful solid cherry door for my workshop, picked the boards myself, milled them flat as a tabletop, glued everything up nice and tight. 6 months later, I could see daylight through the gap on the hinge side. That door had twisted almost a quarter inch, and it wasn't my first time dealing with this. I'd built doors before that bowed. That stuck in summer and rattled in winter, and I could never fully solve it. Then I started looking into how the old European guild joiners built doors, the ones hanging in cathedrals and manor houses that are still perfectly flat after 400, sometimes 600 years. And what I found changed how I think about every door I build. Today I'm going to walk you through exactly what those craftsmen understood about wood movement that most of us were never taught, and how their frame and panel method solves the warping problem permanently. Plus, stick around to the end because I'll show you a trick for raising panels by hand that gives you a result no router bit can match. Let's get into it. Frame and panel construction is one of the most elegant solutions in all of woodworking. It was perfected by guild joiners across England, France, and the Germanic states during the medieval and Renaissance periods, and the basic principle hasn't been improved on since. Once you understand the thinking behind it, you'll never look at a door the same way again. So let me start with where this approach comes from and why these men figured it out in the first place. If you go to any major European city and visit the older churches, the guild halls, the surviving manor houses, you'll find wooden doors that are 300, 400, sometimes over 500 years old. And they're flat. Not approximately flat, flat. The wood has aged, it's darkened. There might be wear marks from centuries of hands pushing them open, but the structure is sound. The joints are tight. The ear panels sit where they're supposed to sit. Now compare that to a modern interior door from any big box store. Give it 5 years in a house with seasonal humidity swings, and there's a good chance it's bowed. The veneer is lifting, or the whole thing is binding in the frame. That contrast is what grabbed my attention. The guild system in medieval Europe was serious business. You didn't just decide to become a joiner. You apprenticed for 7 years, sometimes longer. You learned wood from the tree to the finished piece. And one of the core skills every joiner had to demonstrate was building a proper frame and panel door. It was actually a common masterpiece project, the literal piece of work you had to present to the guild masters to earn your title. These men understood something fundamental about wood that we've largely forgotten in the age of plywood and medium-density fiberboard. They understood that wood is never done moving. It's always responding to the moisture in the air around it. And instead of trying to stop that movement, which is impossible, they designed a system that lets the wood move freely without distorting the structure. That's the core philosophy. Don't fight the wood. Give it room to breathe. Everything I'm about to show you flows from that one idea. Let me start with the problem itself, because if you don't understand why wood warps, no building technique is going to help you. Wood moves. That's not a defect. That's its nature. When the humidity in your shop or your house goes up, wood absorbs moisture from the air and it expands. When the humidity drops, it releases moisture and it shrinks. And here's the critical part. It doesn't move equally in all directions. Wood barely moves at all along its length, maybe a tiny fraction. But across its width, tangential to the growth rings, it can move quite a bit. We're talking about a 12-inch wide white oak board expanding or shrinking by as much as a quarter inch across its width over the course of a year, depending on your climate. Now think about what happens when you take several boards, glue them edge to edge into a wide panel, and hang that as a door. Every single one of those boards is trying to expand and contract across its width. If they're constrained, if they're locked into a rigid frame or screwed tight to hinges that don't allow any movement, all that energy has to go somewhere. And where it goes is into a warp. The door bows, it cups, it twists. The wider the door, the worse the problem. I learned this the hard way more than once. A tabletop can get away with some seasonal movement because it's lying flat and gravity helps. But a door is hanging vertically with nothing holding it flat except its own structure. If that structure doesn't account for wood movement, you're fighting a battle you cannot win. Modern solid core doors try to solve this with engineered materials. They use particle board cores or foam cores wrapped in veneer or laminate. And for a factory-made interior door, that works well enough for a while. But it's a fundamentally different approach than what the guild joiners developed, and it comes with its own problems. Delamination, moisture infiltration at the edges, limited repairability. You can't exactly re-glue and refinish a hollow core door the way you can maintain a solid wood one. The guild approach doesn't try to eliminate wood. It uses solid wood intelligently, and that's a huge difference. Now here's the heart of the whole system, the floating panel. This is the principle that makes everything work. And once you see it, you'll wonder why anyone builds a door any other way. In a frame and panel door, the wide surface of the door, the part you actually see, is not glued, not nailed, not screwed to the frame. It sits in a groove and it floats. Let me say that again because it's that important. The panel floats inside the frame. It's free to expand and contract with the seasons without putting any stress on the surrounding structure. Here's how it works in practice. The frame of the door is made up of vertical pieces called stiles and horizontal pieces called rails. These are relatively narrow, typically 2 to 2.5 inches wide for a standard interior door, sometimes 3 inches, or wider for a heavy exterior door. Because they're narrow, their cross-grain movement is minimal. A 2.5-inch wide white oak style might move 30 seconds of an inch across its width over the course of a year. That's nothing. You'll never notice it. The panel, on the other hand, might be 10 or 12 or even 14 inches wide. That's where all the significant movement happens. But because the panel is just sitting in a groove, free to slide back and forth, it can expand a 1/4 inch in summer and shrink a 1/4 inch in winter. And the door doesn't care. The frame stays perfectly stable, the joints stay tight, the door stays flat. The groove that holds the panel is typically a 1/4 inch wide and 3/8 of an inch deep, cut into the inside edges of all 4 frame members. The panel is thinned at its edges, either by raising it with a plane or by cutting a rabbet on the backside, so that the thinned edge fits into that groove with room to spare. And this is the key detail: you leave a gap. In dry winter conditions, when you're fitting the panel, you want roughly a 1/16 of an inch of space on each side of the panel so that when summer comes and the panel swells, it has somewhere to go. If you make that panel too tight, you've just defeated the entire purpose of the system. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Lost Workshop, and it is a complete guide to hand tool woodworking the way medieval craftsmen actually did it. 156 pages, 17 chapters, 33 illustrations, techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now that you understand the floating panel, let's talk about the skeleton that holds everything together, the stile and rail frame itself. This is where the joinery matters enormously, because the frame has to be rigid and square for the door to function. If the frame racks or loosens over time, the door will sag on its hinges and nothing else you've done will matter. The guild joiners connected their stiles and rails with mortise and tenon joints, and they were meticulous about how they cut them. The standard approach for a door stile is a mortise that's 1/3 the thickness of the stock. So if you're working with 1-inch thick material, your mortise is 1/3 of an inch wide, or close to it. 5/16 works perfectly if you have a chisel that size. The mortise depth is typically 1 1/4 inches, and the tenon length matches, leaving about a 1/16 of an inch of clearance at the bottom of the mortise, so the joint can close fully at the shoulder. The tenon shoulders are what give the joint its rigidity. A well-cut tenon on a door rail has shoulders on all 4 sides, top, bottom, and both faces. Those shoulders register against the face of the stile and lock the frame square. The guild joiners would often draw bore these joints, meaning they'd drill a hole through the mortise, offset the corresponding hole in the tenon by about a 32nd of an inch toward the shoulder, and drive an oak peg through both. When the peg enters the offset hole, it physically pulls the tenon tight into the mortise. This is a permanent mechanical lock that does not depend on glue. I've taken apart drawbar joints from antique furniture that were 200 years old, and the peg still held. That's how reliable this method is. One thing I want to point out is that the groove for the panel runs continuously along the inside edges of both stiles and both rails. When you cut your tenons on the rails, the tenon cheek on the grooved side is already partially formed by the groove itself. This means your tenon width is the full width of the rail minus the 2 shoulders at top and bottom, but the groove side cheek is thinner because the groove has already removed material there. It sounds complicated in words, but once you lay it out on the wood, it makes perfect sense. The key is to cut the grooves first, then lay out your tenons to match. This next method is the one that really surprised me because it goes against the casual way most of us pick boards out of the rack. The guild joiners were extremely deliberate about how they oriented the growth rings in every piece of a door. This practice is sometimes called reading the grain, and it has a huge impact on how the finished door behaves. For the stiles and rails, they preferred rift sawn or quarter sawn stock whenever possible. If you look at the end grain of a quarter sawn board, the growth rings run roughly perpendicular to the face. This orientation minimizes the width of the board's seasonal movement, and it also makes the board far less likely to cup. For the panel, the choice gets more interesting. If the panel is made from a single wide board, quarter sawn is ideal for the same reasons, but most door panels are glued up from 2 or 3 narrower boards. And here the guild joiners followed a strict rule. They alternated the growth rings. The theory, which works beautifully in practice, is that if one board wants to cup slightly in one direction, the adjacent board cups in the opposite direction, and the forces cancel each other out. The panel stays flat. They also paid attention to which face of each board faced outward. They wanted the tightest, most even grain on the show face, and they'd arranged the board so the grain patterns flowed visually across the panel. This wasn't just aesthetics. Tight, even grain on the face means a more stable surface that finishes more uniformly. When I started doing this deliberately, sorting my boards for growth ring orientation before every glue up, the difference was immediate. Panels that used to develop a slight cup after a few months stayed dead flat. It takes an extra 10 minutes of planning and it costs you nothing. With the joinery cut and the wood properly selected, The final step is fitting everything together with the right allowances and applying a finish that protects the wood without trapping moisture. The guild joiners finished their panels before assembly. This is a detail that most modern woodworkers skip, and it matters more than you'd think. If you assemble the door with a raw panel and then finish the whole thing afterward, the finish won't reach the edges of the panel that sit inside the grooves. When the panel shrinks in winter, you'll see a thin line of raw, unfinished wood along the edge of the panel. It looks terrible, and it also means that one part of the panel is sealed and another isn't, which can cause uneven moisture absorption and localized warping. Finishing the panel before assembly eliminates this problem completely. A coat of linseed oil or a thin shellac on all surfaces, including the edges and the back, ensures that moisture enters and leaves the wood evenly from all sides. When fitting the panel into the grooves, the guild joiners would test the fit during a period of moderate humidity, not the driest day of winter, and not the most humid day of summer. They wanted to set the panel roughly centered in its grooves, so it had room to move in both directions. Some craftsmen would put a tiny dab of glue or a small wooden spring pin at the center of the top and bottom panel edges, just to keep the panel centered, not to lock it in place. That way the panel expands equally toward both styles, instead of drifting to one side and binding. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is building doors from wide glued up panels without a frame. Most of us do this because it's simpler and faster. You join your boards, glue them up, cut to size, hang it. But without the frame and panel structure, every inch of that wide panel is fighting against its constraints. The guild approach separates the wide wood from the structural frame so each part can do its job. The second pattern is using pocket screws or biscuits to join door frames. I did this for years because it was quick, but those joints lack the mechanical strength of a proper mortise and tenon, and they rely entirely on glue to hold the frame square under the constant stress of being opened and closed thousands of times. A drawboard, mortise, and tenon will outlast any pocket screw joint by centuries. That's not an exaggeration. The third pattern is finishing the door only after full assembly. Like I mentioned, this leaves hidden raw surfaces that absorb moisture unevenly. The guild practice of pre-finishing the panel before assembly is so simple and so effective that I can't believe I didn't start doing it sooner. The fourth pattern is ignoring growth ring orientation. Most of us grab boards that look good and glue them together however they come off the rack. Taking 5 minutes to study the end grain and arrange your boards deliberately is the single easiest improvement you can make to any panel glue up. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. You don't have to build a cathedral door tomorrow. Just start with the principles and let them guide your next project. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is a technique for raising a panel by hand that I picked up from studying period joinery, and it gives you a result that no router bit can quite replicate. Instead of using a panel raising bit in a router table, take a sharp jack plane or a scrub plane set to a moderate cut, and work the bevel on the panel edge by planing at about a 10-degree angle across the grain from the face side toward the back. You're removing a wedge of material that tapers from the full panel thickness down to about a 1/4 inch at the edge, which is what slips into the groove. The key is to work from the corners inward on the end grain edges first, so any blowout at the corners gets cleaned up when you plane the long grain edges afterward. Then switch to a smoothing plane for the final passes. What you'll get is a gently faceted bevel with a surface quality that catches the light differently than a machined profile. It looks handmade because it is handmade, and it has a warmth and character that I've never been able to get from a router. The first time I did this, I spent about 45 minutes on a single panel, and when I held it up to the light and saw those clean plane facets, I understood why the guild joiners never felt the need for power tools. It takes patience, but the result speaks for itself. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best traditional woodworking methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called The Lost Workshop. 17 chapters of medieval hand tool techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with 33 illustrations and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and if you want more of these deep dives, make sure to subscribe. I will see you in the next one.